We've talked about scope a little bit, but let's explore it a little bit more. We're just going to make a simple class. And we're going to fill out the properties. First, let's make a constructor. We've seen this example before, but I wanted to explore it a little bit more in depth. We know about the this keyword. But what happens if we try to make another variable? Notice how it's actually allowed. So now we have three names. Which name's actually going to be used here? Let's find out. When we look at the code, we can see that we just simply have a constructor. We have name equal name, string name. But now you see how local variable name can't be referenced before it's declared. So what's going on here? This is called scope, lexical scope to be precise. We have name, which is actually declared over here. So this is variable 1, which is used again here. We also have this variable right here in the parameters list. But notice how this suddenly doesn't think it's this. It thinks it's this guy. So we could actually move this up. And suddenly our code thinks it's going to work. Let's run this and find out what happens. In the constructor, it simply prints out hello, because we've made a variable name that is equal to hello. Why is this happening? Scope is a tricky subject, and that's why I wanted to cover it. Here we have what's called a class scope. Whenever you see a block or these little parentheses, brackets, that is a block of code or scope. So here's another one, and you notice how the IDE automatically highlights it. So here's another scope. Now, because this is lexically scoped, the variable that exists above is automatically going to be allowed in this scope, because this is a child scope, if you will. We can actually do this. Now it's where it gets really confusing. Which variable is which? Obviously, there's some naming conventions we should probably adhere to instead of doing something like this. But if we were to run this, we get, you guessed it, the same result. So what's really happening here is this is being ignored because it's no longer treated as a variable. It's a parameter. We're creating a variable here, and we're saying the variable is equal to the variable, meaning there's no change, and then printing it out. What happens if we do this? Suddenly it's fluffy because we're using this as the variable. Name equal name, no change, and then printing it out. Now, what happens if we say this dot name? Notice how when we click on it, the variable appears highlighted. That is called lexical scope right there. Suddenly it prints nothing. And we'll say, just to make it a little more clear what's going on, it's suddenly unknown. Scope can be pretty tricky, and I encourage you to use good naming conventions with your variables and try to avoid situations like this. One thing you need to understand about scope is that it's at all levels of your application, not just in classes. So let's flip back to here, and let's just do a simple example. We're just going to do a for loop. You've probably done a dozen of these, but let's try it anyway. So we're going to print out I, and then we're going to say if I is less than 8, and we're going to say int I equal 5. If I is greater than, we'll say 4. This is a bit confusing. What's going on here? Let's run this and find out. You can see how it says 0 through 9. So we have 10 numbers, and it's saying it is less than 8 and greater than 4, which we know is not true. Why is it doing this? Well, because of this right here. Even though this is valid, it causes issues because of scope. How many scope blocks do we have just here on this page? Well, we have one, the scope here. Then we have this right here, the for loop itself. And then in here, we have another one, this if statement. And we have yet another one right here in this if statement. You could also argue that everything in parentheses is also its own scope, but I really don't treat it that way because most programming languages don't treat it that way. This scope is actually considered part of that right there. So, program doesn't work. To fix it, we would simply copy this, comment that out. Let's run this again. And now suddenly it works as expected. As you can see right here. In short, when in doubt, do not reuse variable names because you're going to have scope problems.